I very much welcome the new political guidance that's been put out to schools. I completely agree we should let children be children. We shouldn't be pushing adult political agendas in schools. Very, very important. And in the guidance, I think there are 19 worked examples to help teachers navigate, some quite tricky issues, which is great. Racism, different political systems, environmentalism, these kind of issues that do come up in schools. But what's conspicuous by its absence in those scenarios is any mention of the teaching of gender ideology, by which I mean schools teaching against guidance that there are more than two sexes, that you can change sex, that if you are gender non-conforming, it might mean that you are the opposite sex to what you are biologically. And I think this is particularly worrying in the context of the interim CAS report, CAS review that came out last week, which obviously was primarily about the gender identity services for children in a health context, but also does mention the fact that socially transitioning a child, as in changing their use of pronouns, changing their names, isn't a neutral act and does have serious consequences further down the line. Now, I know anecdotally from parents that are writing to me, schools in my local area, from what I'm hearing anecdotally, that schools are transitioning pupils against their parents, without their parents' knowledge. They are pumping this view that you can change sex, that you might be a different sex, when often these children are gay and lesbian, they're autistic, that vulnerable children are overrepresented. And I think we've got a serious issue here, but we haven't even scratched the surface. So I suppose my question is twofold. Can we update the guidance to include how teachers should navigate this very difficult issue of gender ideology? And secondly, how can the department investigate what really is happening in schools? Because at the moment, a lot of these reports are obviously anonymous, and it's a very, very difficult area to navigate. But it's a huge safeguarding issue because of the kinds of children that are being let down.
So, I mean, the first thing I'd say is that schools should not be teaching ideology, regardless of in what space that is. And I think we're pretty clear about that in the political impartiality guidance.
And that's why this guidance
schools should be teaching facts and information in that respect. As you said, quite a lot of the allegations, suggestions here are anecdotal. It's important to get to the bottom of each individual issue. We want schools to be able to support pupils, including the small number of pupils who may have gender identity issues and may need support in that respect. And it's important that if they approach members of staff, they can be signposted to the right advice and support, which won't always be people in their school, by the way. I think it's important to reflect on that. But we also need to make sure that issues around sex and gender and identity are taught in an age-appropriate way, listening to the concerns of parents, and that's one of the responsibilities we set out in our guidance around RSHE, so that schools engage with that. But I recognise that there are some really complex legal issues to do with the Equalities Act in this space, and also I know that there are concerns about protecting, for instance, single-sex spaces in some schools in that area. So we are doing a piece of work with the Equalities and Human Rights Commission to look into this space to see if we can provide any further guidance and support in this area. That will take some time because these are not straightforward and simple things, but I think it's important that we balance responsibility to protect protected characteristics of sex with the protected characteristic of gender reassignment, which is also protected under the Equality Act, and we make sure that we address the concerns that parents may have in this space. Now, there have been some examples, I think, where parents have had concerns, those have been raised, and actually where Ofsted has stepped in from a safeguarding perspective or an improvement perspective. So I think it's important that we look at those and take the evidence from those. I think with regard to the political impartiality guidance, I think it's very clear that what we are setting out is that there should never be an attempt to indoctrinate, to impose a particular view on children, but equally that we do have to respect protected characteristics under the Equality Act. And that's the difficult area that schools are trying to navigate. I think we should be doing more as a department to support them in that, and I'm very keen that we do that. I think that's why the Secretary of State undertaking to do this work with the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, I think, is an important step forward on that. Yeah, I appreciate that. But I think going back to the CAS review, the point is that this is, in the medical space, this is the report so far, this is highly unregulated. There is some serious evidence and safeguarding questions. But often what's leading to children getting to these clinics is being told in schools, either by visitors or through the materials that are used in classrooms, that the answer to some of their important teenage struggles is to change sex. Now, the DfE guidelines is very clear that you can't tell children that you can change sex
or that if you're gender non-conforming, it might mean that you're a different sex. That is against the guidance, and yet it is happening. And for these other issues, because the department knows it's happening, we've set out some very helpful worked examples to help teachers navigate those. Why can't we add to that a worked example of what you do when you come across this issue of gender identity? I've seen some of the videos that are being used in schools, where it shows a boy putting nail varnish on, and the implication is perhaps you're actually a girl, or a girl weightlifting and saying, well, perhaps you're actually a boy. Now, these are the kind of gender stereotypes that we did away with in the 1980s, but are being brought back by this ideology, and it is an ideology, there's no basis in science. So how are we going to get that in to this guidance?
Well, as I say, I think the political impartiality guidance is clear about not teaching ideology, not teaching a particular point of view. I think what you just said, the one thing I picked you up on is that you said you're not supposed to teach people that they can change sex. Of course you can do that because you are supposed to teach LGBT content. You should not teach them that they should change sex.
Hang on. You can't, biologically, you cannot change sex. Okay. In every cell in your body, you have sex chromosomes. You cannot change them. But that is a biological fact. So you can tell children that some people believe that you could have a different gender to the sex you're born, but other people, and science says this, you can't teach it as fact, and that's very clear in the guidance.
So, I made the mistake, which I shouldn't have done, of confusing sex with gender in that respect. But I think the point that I would make is that we do need to talk about the world as it is. We need to talk about the fact that people do transition and that there are trans people, and we should support them as a protected group under the Equality Act. So we're not going to rule out people teaching about that. What we should be doing, though, is making sure it's taught in an appropriate way, and making sure that it's not encouraging something which would be medically difficult and could have implications for people's mental health. And the balance we should strike there is about teaching the facts, teaching what we have set out in the RSHE curriculum, not teaching a particular ideology or a particular view. So I'm very clear on that. I think we have set out sufficient examples in the political impartiality guidance to be clear on that, but I'm happy to look at the CAS report and see if there's any further work that we can do. And as I say, I do think that there is room for better guidance to support schools in their safeguarding responsibilities in this respect and in understanding the Equality Act. That's why we want to do this work with the EHRC, and that's why I think it's important that we press ahead with that.
Thank you.
Okay.
Kim,